sense that we're all having to weigh information and judge, what's adequate information, what's trustworthy, better information. We're having to make ethical decisions. And so I thought I'd bring a few of our folks who, function in that domain as well, and we can think about some of those questions. So Daryl and David and Laura, if you'd first just take a moment, introduce yourselves, give us a little bit about your credentials and how long you've been at First Central and why. And we'll go alphabetically. So Laura, you get to go first. So.
Oh, okay. I will unmute. Let me know if you can't hear me.
I can hear you.
So I teach philosophy at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and I've been there for 20 years. And so I was trying to use that to reason out, like, how long had I been at First Central? And I'm not quite sure, because we started going there when we first moved to Omaha, which was a little more than 20 years ago. And our church was St. Paul United Church of Christ in Lincoln. That's where we had gotten married. And so we started attending just as visitors for a while. And many of you familiar faces were very friendly, welcomed us. I recognize some of you even from way back then. And then eventually, I think after our first daughter was baptized, I think we became members of the church at that point. So you've probably seen us off and on. We have 3 kids, Elizabeth, Alexis, and Patton.
Daryl.
Well, I think we've been members at First Central since, I'm just going over 30 years now. I think it's 31 years. And why? Well, we lived clear out at 214th and Harney. And, we experimented, when we moved to town, we experimented around a while and finally decided, we've got to, settle. And, actually, I was active in the state conference on the board of directors at the time we moved to First Central. First Central is just simply the flagship of the denomination for these parts. We've had such a long history of involvement in the denomination, and that turned out to be a terrific fit for us. And I couldn't be happier, and it turns out 16-mile drive isn't really that big a deal. Got used to it right away. So.
Your academic credentials.
Oh, well, such as they are. I actually, this is actually more of an economic statement, supply and demand. I am the only periodontist that I've ever been able to locate that has anthropology credentials. I spent a couple years teaching biological anthropology, and that, I got to tell you, that was really fun. The problem is it's just easier to make a living as a periodontal surgeon. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I sold out. And looking back now, I kind of wish, I a lot wish I had stayed in academics, because I'm just more comfortable there, and I'm kind of tired of being inside people's faces all the time anyway.
Well, and you're on the denomination's Science and Faith Network as well.
Yeah, I've had this stack of, I've had more than one denominational office in the board of directors and the General Synod nominating committee, but the science and technology group, which I haven't been able to participate in, nobody else is now either. I don't know what they're doing. That was delightful because we had representatives from the major, what do we call ourselves, old guard churches, main lines, Episcopalians, Presbyterian USA, who am I leaving out? A lot of people. The ELCA, big contributors, and so forth. And it was delightful, and we saved ourselves from reinventing the wheel. It turns out the ELCA produces wonderful, well-researched documents when they decide to. Episcopalians are very productive. I think we did our part. But yeah, our idea was to not reinvent the wheel for each denomination. And it's been really helpful. So.
Well, David.
Yeah. I'm a practicing molecular geneticist I still have a colony of mice, tinker with machines and so forth. But I suppose I'm on this panel because I also, for 15, 20 years, I also taught a course to graduate students in birth defects. And we did the mechanics of the process, what went wrong and why and so forth. But we also talked a lot about how you deal with people who are dealing with how do you approach the parents? How do you approach the child? And you've got to think about things like hurt, anger, acceptance, and then you've got to convince them that they need to participate in the process, because people can give up, and the outcomes are not good, and it's up to you as a clinician to think about how you're going to approach these people in a way that they will actually buy in to dealing with this aspect in their lives. So that's the kind of thing I do in terms of bioethics. But in terms of my participation in the church, I've been a member for about 17 years. And some of the things I like about it is that there's a real good mix of the intellectual side and the humane side, and that's kind of what you think about when you're dealing with a course like that. From my own personal point of view, I like the fact that I can work on my spirituality in my own way and at my own pace. Nobody's trying to sell me a particular point of view or anything. But I also like the fact that I'm experiencing help with these kinds of problems. I can talk to people. I can feel them thinking about what they're saying and identify with. So it's a good mix.
Cool. And I got to be a guest at David's class a couple of times when they were in their bioethics unit. So got to witness how good a professor he was. So
it's strange I didn't cross paths with you, David. I was on the craniofacial malformation team at Children's Hospital for several years. And to be honest, when I quit participating in that, it was because of stress.
Oh.
And we could discuss that sometime. After my daughter died, and I just simply thought I didn't need that extra bit of difficulty.
Well, let's. So, what do you find most uncertain at this current moment? Let's just start right there. So, what's the uncertainty that you are grappling with?
Well, if you don't mind, if we just jump in, I
just
don't know
go.
if you want to call on us or.
No, I don't plan to call on you. Let's just
right,
chat.
Okay. I guess for me, the uncertainty really boils down to one of the most important things in life, I think, for a lot of us is how we maintain our relationships with other people, those relationships with the people closest to us. And this pandemic is affecting our certainty about how to be in those relationships because, for example, I don't know when I'm going to be able to see my parents in person again. When will I be able to give my parents a hug or, other than the virtual variety, which they say works? When will my children go back to school? And if we do open school, can I trust, with a different type of certainty about knowledge and information, that it's safe to send them back? So I guess for me, those are the ones that loom largest because I can live with other kinds of insecurity and uncertainty better. But when I feel those things with respect to the people I'm closest to, that's when it really gets me.
Sure.
Well, I guess what I thought about when I was thinking about these issues is how we how we view uncertainty. To some extent, the opposite of an uncertainty is predictability. It's determinism, to use a big word. And if the whole world were stuck in a deterministic loop, it really wouldn't be a whole lot of fun. And so the flip side of uncertainty is the fact that we do have things like free will and choices and changes and evolutions and so forth. And we need those things. We wouldn't do well without them. So we kind of deal with uncertainty as the evil twin of all those good things from an indeterminate kind of society.
That's a fair point. Daryl, what do you got?
Well, we or at least I personally know, I think we all do. We face it daily. But who would have thought that the grocery store would have been on the list of uncertainties? But I don't know about you folks, but I ponder for a week before I head out to a public place, and I probably shouldn't, because I'm certainly past the age for going on the list and not being on the list for a kidney transplant or anything. So I've given it a lot of thought, and I've discussed it with my daughter, and she's advised me against it, but finally got used to the idea that once a week I'm going to one or more stores, and yes, when I come home, I'll leave my shoes at the door and leave my rest of my clothes 3 feet inside the door, and yes. And but yeah, and uncertainty has invaded into things that I think we felt pretty certain about,
or just never thought about.
I never gave it a thought. Yeah.
So one way to approach uncertainty is from this issue of knowledge. What do we know? And in philosophy, we call that epistemology is the big word. So right now, a lot of us are processing a lot of information. It seems that most people are trying to be conscientious and good citizens, and so daily trying to keep up with the news and information. But it comes from a variety of sources. It doesn't always agree. The advice can change from one week or month to another. Just like the news this week, that now we probably don't have to worry about surfaces that much now that we've all spent 2 weeks or 2 months wiping down our groceries. Maybe didn't need to do that. Part of this is, I think, because we're watching a scientific process unfold under the public eye in a way that we don't normally do, as they're trying to understand it. And of course, it has ramifications for our daily lives. So first, let's just approach it from that angle. How do we better process the information we're receiving? And then that kind of goes to the big question of how do we make decisions with inadequate or unclear data? So, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I sort of look at it from the point of view of, a scientist applying for a grant or trying to maintain my credentials and so forth. When you're doing that sort of thing, you wind up getting peer reviewed, is what they call it, and so you have to be paying attention to your peers when you write one of these things, or you're going to run afoul. And one of the things you realize is that there's really a clash of egos going on in science, and everybody's if they've got the ego to write such a grant, they're going to have a position, and they're going to defend it, and they're going to believe it's right. So you get a clash of perspectives of people when you're dealing with your colleagues, writing grants, applying for $500,000 worth of money, and so forth. And everybody's got a different perspective. It's sort of like the the guy's trying to describe an elephant. You know, 4 different approaches, 4 different perspectives on what an elephant is. And so you have to accept that kind of thing when you're looking at what's coming out in the popular science that's in the newspapers now. You know, and there's always going to be a process of integration and decision making and compromise when it comes to, you know, whose position is going to become the scientific paradigm, and who's going to be awarded the grants to do the research. So there, you got to look at it as a human clash out there of ideas and perspectives, and that they're all going to, at some point, they're going to wind up being integrated. But until they are, you're going to have these egos going in multiple directions, all of which probably contribute to the truth, but maybe not with the kind of single-minded determination that you see in the news. Somebody says this is the right way or that's the right course to do the battle. And you live with, if you're going to delve into the scientific research, you've got to be willing to let the battle happen and await the outcome, like the rest of us.
There's a story that science advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
And although right now, like 100,000 funerals at a time, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting because that's the situation we're always in, even at other times, not during this crisis. We have difficulty, if we are not experts, making sense of what experts say when they disagree. So if there was only one expert and we could just hear directly from that person, everything would be solved. But like you say, David, there are many experts and they're all competing. And part of what drives them is that they have to have some confidence that they're on the right track and that they're moving towards some goal that is inspired by their own insight, their own research. Well, meanwhile, the rest of us are dealing with 20 of those reports from people who may or may not agree, different puzzle pieces that may not fit. So I guess in philosophy, we teach critical reasoning, and one of the things we try to tell our students is, on the one hand, you have to forgive yourself for not being an expert in everything, right? So especially at a time like this, forgive yourself for not knowing everything, right? We can't possibly be experts in everything at once. At the same time, you also can exercise a responsibility that I think we feel good when we exercise, and that is to do the best you can at ferreting out good information and good sources and subjecting it to questioning. So one of the things I like about this church, as a matter of fact, is this idea that we're still in conversation, we're still questioning. And so I really like that, when we do encounter evidence, even if it seems to be excellent, even if it comes from the best sources, questioning is good. That's what experts want you to do. They want you to be involved in a dialogue and to be thinking and asking the next set of questions. So we can take stock of common cognitive biases we have, like, for example, avoiding uncertainty, right? Making everything fit into a neat picture doesn't always happen, but we have a preference for neat stories, for things that make it all fit. And we can take stock of the usual fallacies that we are tempted by. And apart from that, I think just being really sensitive to the sources of information is important. And I think it will help us feel better when we know we're getting our sources, information from the best possible sources, because we think, well, I may not know everything right now, I can't know everything right now, but this is the best I can do because I'm looking to the right people to inform me.
Yeah, one of the things that has kind of annoyed me as a philosopher for the last couple months is, and this is pretty much a creature of social media, is how many times people seem to be non-experts, read one article and then spout that as like the gospel truth. And so I've been kind of a critical reasoning voice in comment threads for a lot of people, more so the people I actually care about. No, people, but Michael has said that my doing that has gotten a little annoying in the course of the last couple of months, trying to force people into some better critical reasoning. Janet's question kind of anticipates where I'm going to go next, but Daryl, I didn't know if you had anything extra you wanted to say on that point.
Well, you know me, I've got a graphic for it. I'll try.
Okay.
I'll try and show you a screen share here. We'll see if we can find our way back from there. Actually, is what this is. Do you get that one?
Not at the moment. Here we go.
Oh, okay. It came out of a recent issue of Science. This is the pro-vaccine. These are Facebook pages, and the pro-vaccine ones are the blue. I don't know if I can. Does my pointer work up there? We'll see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then some of these are widely disconnected. The green ones are the neutral Facebook pages, but the red ones are the anti-vaccine pages. And you know, one of the things they point out is that the pro-vaccine pages are relatively isolated. They're way out here in this area and way over here. And actually, they predict that the anti-vaccine people will win on the Facebook world of knowledge. That's a kind of a sobering thought. That's what science is up against. And this is how a lot of the public's making up their mind. So now we'll see if I can get out of this screenshot.
So misinformation is a serious problem. So it's not just how do we weigh the competing scientific information, it's filtering out the conspiracy theories, misinformation, and battling that, right?
Have you got your screen back?
Not yet. It's still yours. So
yeah, I hope I don't have to kick the plug out of the wall.
I hope so too. So let me move on to my next question, which gets to the one that Janet texted a minute ago. So those of us who study epistemology know that part of is that we create some guidelines for how we judge information. So one approach is that knowledge must meet certain criteria. Often that's some version of justified true belief. There's the other kind of virtue approach that can trust information that results from reliable processes. So what do you think should be our guidelines for determining what is trustworthy and reliable? And Daryl, Deb says, stop sharing should be at the top of your screen.
At the top. Okay. Oh, this. Golly, I hope I find it pretty soon. Filter screen, bottom, top.
Oh, I have finally found the chat. Is it okay to respond to things that are in the chat?
Yeah.
Question? Yeah. This is a good question from Janet here about how do we evaluate the trustworthiness of information? And that really gets to the question that you're talking about, right? Yeah. And so part of it is, I think, just, again, going back to David's point, getting comfortable with the fact that experts disagree. And so we're going to have to rest in a situation that we don't feel comfortable in, but we have to somehow paradoxically get comfortable with that discomfort, you know, of never really feeling like we know enough, because that's not something we can do. But what we can do is to just keep ourselves aware and informed and take in the best information we can. So I think one thing I find very helpful is just, first of all, to tell myself, I know I can't be perfect in this regard. And so, and someone else mentioned feeling guilty too. Maybe it was the same person that mentioned feeling guilty about contacting people. Well, we can't have perfection. I'm not going to be able to dip my entire house in Lysol and my car, and you know, we can't have it perfect, but we can take the most common sense measures that we know could help, and we do the best we can. So we hand wash, we do everything we can to protect people from the germs we're breathing out. And it's the same with information. I think that we know we can't have perfection, so we do the best we can with what we know is a reliable source. So we go to academic sources, we go to sources that we trust to be objective in the news, which is hard these days. But I think when you find when you find a media source that seems to stick pretty closely to presenting factual information and keeping the editorializing separate from that information, oftentimes I find that the sources I trust most are kind of partisans on both sides dislike them because because they're not partisan, they're sort of in the middle. That is sometimes a good sign that they tend to be a very fair presentation of information. But I think sticking closely to, especially with information about the pandemic, to interpretations of studies that are being published. So for example, study just came out in the Lancet. I'm not going to have the expertise to read through and understand every detail of what's published in the Lancet, but I know that if somebody else who is at a trusted source, like maybe an NPR or, you know, a publication that I have trusted for years to give me pretty objective accounts of what's happening elsewhere, and they're using as their primary source this scientific article, then at least I feel like I'm getting something on a level I can understand that gets close to that original source in a good way.
On a more general perspective, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. On a more general kind of analysis, one of the things that every year we are required to sign in my professional career, if I am accepting money from the National Institute of Health, which I am, I'm required every year to sign what's known as a conflict of interest statement. And in this statement, they rigorously go through any conflicts that might influence my objective ability to, you know, present the data that I've acquired and publish it. And so, you know, you need, the generalized question here is, you need to look for conflicts of interest. Ask yourself, are these sources in any way biased in their decision-making process on the basis of basically money? At least in, you know, conflict of interest. This is, you know, is somebody likely to be making money as a result of this work? You know, so you get people who are not only doing the research and publishing their results, they're also on the board of directors of some pharmaceutical company. You know, and so you know, every scientific publication has to contain a disclaimer about how what might be biasing your perspective and your decisions as to what to publish and what to say in that publication.
Battery level very low.
I guess we lost Daryl, so hopefully he'll come back on in a minute. But he did try out the screen sharing before we ever started to know that he knew how to get in and out of it. But so I'm not, you know, you can practice technology all you want and then in the moment have an issue. So hopefully Daryl can get back to us here in a second. You know, we've got some sort of follow-up questions on that. You know, it's sometimes difficult to figure out who the experts are and that sort of thing. And I know for me, to me, one of the things I find particularly annoying in this current moment is a lack of epistemic humility. So when people seem to claim to have more information and authority and expertise than they in fact do. And to me, one of my criteria and guidelines for judging someone is if they are more explicit about their ambiguities and uncertainties and don't speak as if they know for certain. And so what do you think? Is that a good guideline? Is that a good criteria? What's the role of epistemic humility in the current moment?
I don't know if David wants to answer that one first, because that's really.
No, that's the parakeets.
Oh, that's the parakeets. Okay. Well, I actually think, following up on what you just said, though, that's really an important aspect, I think, of responding to information that we get, is to ask these questions about where does it come from, what interest do people have in promoting it, and then what Scott just said about, are they telling me a trustworthy version of that story? So sometimes you have to be a little alert to potential motives people might have, or like funding sources or other influences that can make something that otherwise seems to be objective and trustworthy less so. But I think this telling of a very neat story that all fits together, that people are completely confident about, is a good sign that something might be amiss. Another sign that I think is really telltale, we try to emphasize in critical reasoning, especially when it comes to dealing with theories, but it can work in almost any context, is when people are presented with questioning and criticism, is that welcome? Is that engaged in an open and positive manner? Or do people reject and try to shut down questioning and criticism? Because trustworthy processes and methods do have this kind of epistemic humility, and part of it is being excited about asking questions and encouraging other people to critique and to ask questions. So one way that people can avoid that is by giving an ad hoc defense of theories. So it's the kind of thing where there's always an explanation. And a great example of that we have nowadays is this kind of QAnon. I don't know if you've heard of it. I just read an article about it in the Atlantic. It's a strange conspiracy theory, but one of the telltale signs that it is a kind of strange conspiracy theory is that whenever you ask a question about something that seems to be a hole in it, there's always a perfect explanation. And then if you keep asking questions, there's always an answer. There's always an answer. But people who are true experts usually very quickly gets to points where they say, we don't have that answer. We want that answer. Here's what we're going to try to do to investigate it, but we don't know yet. Or we have some conflicting information. Let me tell you about the difficulty we have with this conflicting information. So when you hear those kinds of answers, that's a sign that people are engaging in the critical reasoning process. They're open to your questions and critique. If they're not open to it, or they've always got a pat answer that plugs the gaps, no matter where they appear, that's a pretty bad sign that something might be wrong.
Good points. Yeah. Daryl, are you back with us? We can't see you, but
yeah. And let me see if I.
Well, now you've muted yourself. So, well, David, you want to take a stab at that epistemic humility?
Yeah, and basically, I'd just be echoing what Laura said, that you need to evaluate the source. You need to critically evaluate the source. Looking for people who are trying to sell an agenda, as opposed to people who are seeking a path. If you're seeking a path, as Laura said, you ultimately come to the point where you're at the cutting edge of what's known and what's not known, and you need to be able to say that. If you're unwilling to do that, it suggests that you're not really being honest with your audience.
Do I have my sound back?
Yeah.
Yeah, you do.
Video and sound. So we were talking about kind of guidelines for judging information. How do we know what's trustworthy and reliable? Questions 5 and 6 on what I sent you, but kind of if you want to kind of roll answers to both into one. So.
Oh, sort of. The neat thing about science is that you have to get used to the fact that, with everything you discover, the answer to every question is more questions, really. and particularly, David, I think in the DNA business, you've had your career tipped upside down and backwards over and over again by new techniques that come along. just like DNA polymerase suddenly changed everything. Well, this has happened over and over again in my view of genetics, but you get a much more interesting view. Someone once explained to me that if you believe God does everything, God's responsible for everything, then everything by definition is a conspiracy. And yeah, and then recently I posed a question to a psychologist who's a very dedicated NRA member. And I said, what's that really all about? And it kind of gave him pause, and he said, I think it's exchanging something you think is a sure thing for something that you otherwise find unsure, looking for certainty. And maybe that's true. I haven't completely processed that answer, because there's a lot of other stories about.
I do think that's one of the appeals to of fundamentalism or certain worldviews, is that they do have all the answers to all the questions, and a lot of humans don't like living with ambiguity.
I think the rottenest thing you can say to somebody at a funeral is, well, this is all in God's plan. Or my daughter's funeral, somebody said, well, that she's in a better place now. And my wife's response was, yeah, but I think she wanted to stay here a bit longer. It's but that inability to be comfortable with uncertainty in science, you got to get over that right away.
So one way to deal with this is this question of knowledge, but right now all of us are kind of compelled to make decisions and act with inadequate knowledge. So another way of approaching this uncertainty is from the side of ethics. What's the morally right and good thing to do, the wise thing to do? So what do you view as the most significant moral issues that we are having to deal with at the moment? Maybe us as kind of individuals, not necessarily, or you could think, society wide. But
I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free to do so. But one of the things, just by way of transition, this gets back to the question you just asked about knowledge, but to transition to this question about ethics, I think there is a kind of ethical demand on us to learn to live with ambiguity, to learn to live with not having all the answers, but to be able to try to act anyway. And that's hard. I mean, that's a really difficult thing. Like this, going back to one of the things in the chat above, right? Feeling guilty about what if my choices hurt other people because I wasn't able to get access to the right information, or I misinterpreted, I did the wrong thing. I mean, that can be very paralyzing. That can be really frustrating. And so I think there's a tendency that most of us feel to try to resolve those ambiguities, to resolve uncertainty. And so then, touching on what Daryl just said, we have to somehow get used to it, right? But we're not all scientists. We're not all used to doing that every day as part of our research program. So how do the rest of us do that if we aren't researchers? Well, if we start to demand pat stories, that can be very psychologically destructive. I think even for some people who have even clinical anxiety or things like OCD, it can be extremely destructive if they're reassured. So if you're constantly responding to uncertainty by reassuring yourself and saying it's going to be okay, or I have a story that makes sense of all this, I can smooth away all these rough edges and make sense of it for myself, that can just reinforce to you the idea that you were right to be anxious, that you should be anxious about uncertainty and you need to get rid of it. And so it can be very difficult to just learn to live with it, let it settle, to let it sit. And one way to do that as an exercise is really just to think about it's almost a Stoic exercise, right? The Stoics were big on this, asking yourself in a particular narrow sphere, what things are under my control and what things aren't under my control. And then I'm not sure how exactly they got it done, but trying to convince yourself that that's okay, right? And part of the way they got it done was a larger metaphysical worldview, but I think it helps just in a small sphere to say something like, with respect to going out with a mask on, that you're worried about. What are my obligations? How good does my mask have to be? What if I inadvertently expose someone? Should I be in a store, right? So these are all, I don't know if you're feeling that way, I'm feeling those kinds of stressful questions. And so one way to accept that is to say, I've read some good information about masks. I got it from a source that I checked to see if it was reliable. You know, maybe I went to the medical center site. That's one place I've been looking, is the University of Nebraska Medical Center. So if I'm following what they say about masks, if I get it wrong, well, then the whole of UNMC has it wrong too, right? So that can help me to know I'm doing my best with good information. And then I say, you know, what's under my control is me trying to do my best with the information I have. What's not under my control, how people respond to me, right? How other people might interpret my actions, whether people disagree with me, those kinds of things aren't things I can control, right? What I can control is just getting access to good information, doing the best I can with it. So if I can assure myself of those things, I'm not reassuring myself that everything's going to be okay or that there's a neat story to explain everything, but I am reassuring myself I'm going to keep doing the best that I can with the small things that I can control, and I'm going to let the rest go because I can't control what every other person is doing.
I loved that answer. That was really good. I was wondering when you were going to get to the Stoics, and so I'm glad. Yeah, so glad. But that was fantastic. Thanks, David, Daryl. Anyone want to add to that? So
can't follow the act, but on the other hand, to it. But I bet you couldn't access it.
I couldn't access it.
Oh, rats. That's it. Well, it was too.
That's a problem when academics share things. They don't realize that everybody else can't get to it. So,
yeah.
Especially since I can't get to my university office, which I would have access to things. So
yeah, this was a book review in well, it was more than that. It was no, it's not a book review. Excuse me. May 1st issue of Science: Tinctures of Time and Schrödinger's Virus. We all know the Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, where the cat's in a box and we don't know if it's dead or alive until somebody opens the box, and then whatever the state was at that time you're stuck with. And so somebody, and this is kind of fun because it comes off of Facebook, somebody posted, it's become kind of popular, Matt Cran, now enjoying his 15 minutes of Facebook fame. Because we cannot get tested, we can't know whether we have the virus or not. We have to act as if we have the virus so we don't spread it to others. We have to act as if we've never had the virus because we didn't have it, we're not immune. Therefore, we both have and don't have the virus, thus Schrödinger's virus. and you know, that
yeah.
Nobody knows who this guy is. It just appeared as a Facebook thing, and it's quite nice. But this is the something from New Mexico, History of Science. Louis Campos, who I don't know, but quotes Emily Dickinson with a very tiny poem. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. You know, because it's got to do, there's a certain amount of belief mixed with being able to figure out what the, you know, how to act in something that we can't see. We're not so sure about the knowledge. We don't know if it's alive on a surface. We don't know whether you can't really get much done in IV if you choose not to breathe. You know, it's a difficult thing. And so it's the May 1st issue of Science, and I bet you can sneak in online now, but it's got to be old enough.
So what I was thinking about was, you know, the process of how we make a good decision based on imperfect information. And, you know, the problem is, in the absence of perfect information, you can generate a lot of anxiety about your decision. And the problem with making a decision in in the face of anxiety is that your temptation is often to make the first decision that pops into your head, you know, sort of jerk your decision on the basis of goodness knows what. And the problem, the better way to make the decision, it seems to me, is to stop the anxious jerk and make your and come back at your decision a second time or a third time. Don't feel as though you have to force a decision when in fact you probably don't. And if you can do that, and you come to the same decision a second or a third time, it may be a more valid, a more well thought out decision with more perspective and more information. So it's the anxiety that rushes the decision that makes for poor decision making process.
Well, that's good too. Laura, if someone wanted to, they had time to read the Stoics right now, is there any particular text you would recommend?
Sure, I can post a link for you if you want to. It may not be the perfect translation online, but there are translations online. So, and there's also better translations that are inexpensive and easy to obtain. So I can post a few links, but one of my favorites is Epictetus, just because. And I know a lot of people really like reading Marcus Aurelius too, and I do too, but Epictetus, it's short, it's sort of short and sweet. It starts from the very first, the handbook is what he has other texts, but the handbook is the one I'm thinking of. And it starts right off with this question of just what's in your control and what's not. Let's start there, right? Like, let's figure out what you can do. You can control your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions. You can't control what's happening in the world around you. You know, you can't make the virus disappear. You can't affect what other people are doing or not doing about it, but you can control you. And it's also inspiring to me, I guess, because his life was so incredibly challenging, that he was born into slavery. He was severely physically abused. And so when he says these things about, you know, I'm not going to cede control of my own thoughts. I'm not going to cede control of my own feelings, but I do acknowledge I don't control what's going on around me in the world. I can't adjust the entire world, but I can adjust myself. He's really lived it in a way that's profound, that most of us hopefully will never have to experience. So it's helpful to read it, I guess, because you think if he could make it through that, and if that was the advice that got him through, maybe it can work for me with my small problems, you know, with my dog or my kids. I might be able to use some of his advice. So he's an inspiration. I think Seneca is also very helpful, because Seneca focuses a lot on how to process these emotions that we're having. And the Stoics, I mean, they get kind of a bad rap because people say, well, they were all about suppressing those emotions or erasing them or ignoring them. And that's true. You don't want to do that. That wouldn't be good. But they have some helpful techniques for dealing with those emotions. And I think they believe that if we practice those techniques, we will be less bothered by the difficult emotions. So for example, anger. I think it's quite normal for people to be feeling angry about the current situation. That's not very much acknowledged. It's sort of embarrassing to admit I'm angry about things that are going on. I'm mad at other people who aren't doing what I want them to do. I'm mad that I'm in this situation or that my loved ones are affected. So having some text that can help you walk through that anger, to say it's normal to have angry responses. Here's why you're having them. Let's sit back and think about other ways that we can decide how we want to respond, choose how we want to process that anger. I think that can be very helpful at a time like this for just maybe getting through the day to day.
Well, and am I right that Marcus Aurelius's meditations were written during the Antonine Plague? So
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I would have to check to be sure, but
I know people are kind of into plague literature.
He had dealt with that problem. Let's put it that way. And
Yeah.
as a leader, and he had a strange life too, sort of groomed for leadership from a young age. and, you know, not born into it, but chosen for the job and trained for it. It's a kind of strange story. And then there were so many things that could have turned out otherwise that would have prevented him from becoming emperor, but in fact, it all worked out such that he did. And he certainly, I think if we start to think about larger political responses, it's very interesting maybe to read some things that he writes and think about how his experiences trying to solve problems for an entire society have influenced his advice.
So one of the issues that have read some about is people talking about moral fatigue, that since routine decisions like going to the grocery store, etc., things that we used to not even think of really in the context of as ethical decisions now suddenly have this ethical weight, and because there's inadequate information and everything, people having to do their best, that there's a sense of kind of moral fatigue in having to do this. So what wisdom do you share on how we should make moral decisions in this moment? What are the basic values that are guiding you, and what would you suggest that be the basic values to guide us?
I feel embarrassed to jump in on this first. Maybe I feel like less expert on this issue for sure. Something I'm struggling with too. I think, you know, I said this before, so I'm sorry to repeat the same thing again, but I think it's really important to forgive ourselves.
Oh, you're muted. Somehow you're, Laura.
Accidentally muted myself, sorry, bonked
Okay.
the thing. Really important to forgive ourselves and to forgive other people. Because we're dealing with something really difficult and unprecedented here. And I think there's going to be a lot of reactions we have, a lot of things that happen that just we haven't had to prepare for in the past. I think, you know, my parents, I talked to them a lot about this, and I think they have a little different feeling because they've lived through a lot of things that were very difficult, and that is giving them some resilience. So they're like, yeah, well, when we were kids, it was the Great Depression, right? It was World War II. We lived through those things, and that was extraordinarily important as a formative experience in their childhood. And so they have some resources to draw on in that regard to say, hey, this too shall pass. We've been through something like this. We've seen how our parents had to deal with the challenges. So that's inspiring to me to listen to them. And they have a lot of, I think, patience and grace for how other people are responding to it, given what they've been through. So they're able to be more patient with people who maybe I get impatient because I think, why aren't you wearing your mask? Or why aren't people doing this or doing that? Why aren't people deciding things the way I would decide it? And I think having some patience with that and knowing that it's really difficult. We're all struggling to do the right thing. And we have to try to be patient with others who we think are making a good faith effort. Now, if people aren't making a good faith effort, I can see that's very frustrating. Maybe not everybody is, but I think for a lot of people, they're trying under difficult circumstances. And the other thing is just paradoxically, the difficulties we're having, the epistemic difficulties we talked about earlier, those haven't changed. I mean, we're always dealing with the situation where we have competing expert advice. Suppose you get any other medical diagnosis, 5 years ago or 5 years from now, and you would still be asking these questions about how do I find good expert advice on this thing? How do I make sense of the differences between what doctor number one or doctor number two is saying? Those kinds of problems, right? We face those problems always. And so in that sense, this isn't radically different in kind. It's just that it has focused a bunch of problems in an immediate moment in a strange new way of living, but we're still able to use the same resources we had before. And I wanted to just point out too what people are, I don't know if everyone can see the chat, I got the little chat box up, but I thought that what they're saying over here is really great about agility and having some confidence. I think that's part of being patient with yourself too, to say, I may not have all the answers, I know I'm doing an imperfect job, but I'm committed to doing the best that I can, and I'm committing to trying to respond to changing situations.
Daryl?
I don't know. Laura's a hard act to follow. The fatigue thing, it's all around us. I mean, um, hello. I'm kind of like so many people have said to me, I just won't watch the news anymore. Well, I can't bring myself to do that, but it does fatigue me. It's I don't want to put my head in the sand, and I don't think I'm using much escapism, but the amount of energy and someone mentions being on Zoom 4 to 6 hours a day. There's stuff being written about how that's changing us, and I'm really glad to have Zoom. I mean, good grief, this is wonderful. One outcome is I'm spending more time in church now than I ever have before in my life. And I mean, I really am. How many times a week am I in a Zoom meeting or something like this in a week? And I, of course, still haven't completely mastered Zoom because I wouldn't know how to get another screen off of there if I put it up.
Well, I found that one of the really fascinating threads in neuroscience these days is, looking at the you wind up, there is actually a basis for calling moral fatigue a kind of fatigue. It is. Your brain is working overtime dealing with these things. And so, that's why I say that it's important to stop your process, stop jerking your decisions resulting from fear and anxiety, and spend some and allow the process to repeat and see how your responses change with time and with additional information. So if you do this kind of thing, you can ask yourself. A very wise old lady once told me that when you're involved in an emotional and an exhausting, anxious kind of situation, what you need to do is say to yourself, just stop the process, and ask yourself, is this thing something, is this kind, is this loving, is this a wise decision that you're making? Just stop the whole machinery and allow the anxiety to dissipate. And if you can do that and you can come back at your decision, I think think about these things, kindness, loving, and wise decisions, you can probably come up with a better decision than you could in the face of moral fatigue.
Yeah, I know back in March when the information just was coming, fast, and over about 10 days, everything radically altered. I got to the point where I was tired of trying to make a new decision every day. So
yeah.
I know I just set an okay, we're going to have this meeting 3 days from now, and we'll just wait and make a decision then, the best information, that instead of every day trying to stay on top of what was changing. So let's see. So I do feel like we should at least address a little bit of the political question. None of us are political philosophers. This is one of the many times we miss Kent. But are you concerned at all with government power at a moment like this, its effects upon civil liberties, privacy. Deb sent me a question this week that, how do we balance our concern for, privacy of our own information with what may end up being necessary for adequate contact tracing? Bye, sweetie. And anyone want to take a stab at that kind of set of questions? And
well, I guess what struck me about it was the danger of power getting usurped by people who are playing on the fact that we are morally fatigued, and rather in a state of moral fatigue, we are liable to want somebody to step in and make decisions for us. And there are certainly people who are willing to do that, And so I think that's probably a significant danger in kind of a situation. I mean, I think of the way Adolf Hitler shut down the Reichstag in 1933. That was the middle of the Depression. The Germans had just lost a war. We're still suffering from the after effects of the war. They were fatigued, and they saw Adolf as an easy solution, a less energetic solution, actually involving themselves and finding out what was going on, and participating in a democracy.
I think that's a really important point, that democracy requires work and it's not easy, and especially when things aren't going smoothly. It can be so tempting to just rally around something that seems like a quick solution, easy solution. And so that's why I would say there is a enormous political dimension to this demand that we learn how to live with the uncertainty of our current situation. Because if we let ourselves be overcome by that, and we are drawn to any kind of quick fix or an easy solution or something that can sum it up in a neat narrative, whether it's true or false, then we're not doing the work of democratic citizens. We're not doing what's demanded of us, and we're going to contribute to maybe far worse problems happening because of that. So it's a hard thing to do, though, and it does require a certain resilience to be able to face this constant onslaught of anxiety about, what should I do now? What's happening this week? What should I be how should I be responding? Those things they're tiring, and especially when we're worried about other people and we have a lot of other brand new demands on us, that can be very difficult. I really relate to this thing about the safe place, right? It's like, as long as we lock everything down, I'm here, I'm not, then I'm not responsible for hurting anyone, I can control what's going on. There's a real temptation to want to do that, but somehow we have to get ourselves comfortable with the fact that we're not going to have an easy answer, that things aren't going to go in a predictable way, and we won't have an ability to do that for quite some time now, which can be very, very stressful.
And I'm particularly interested in the fact that, power is devolving to the executive branch of government at this point. And it isn't just Trump. I mean, it's been an ongoing process for several administrations. And it seems to me that Congress and the judiciary are maybe not taking up their responsibility to maintain the balance of power, and and possibly in this time of further uncertainty, we're even more vulnerable to let somebody else do it, and that would be the executive.
And back to the fatigue.
Yeah.
We've all become armchair epidemiologists, had to, and the same with the media. We understand terms now, news cycle and controlling the narrative and all that stuff. We've been slowly immersed in that. That's a whole new kind of language thing that snuck up on us. Now we all know that if you got something really rotten to announce, you do it on Friday night and hope that other news will swallow it. And that's, and some people are really good at controlling the narrative and all of that. And I personally am fatigued by it. And that's I guess that's part of how you do that nowadays. I just long for quieter time with a 13-inch black and white TV, I guess. If the other channel wouldn't come in, well, you still had this one,
Although if we were in that quieter time, we wouldn't be able to do this.
Exactly.
We might be even more isolated from one another.
It's true.
David, Deb had a follow-up to your question that I think is important. She said, are you suggesting that we should then resist the test, contact, isolate model as giving up too much control to a central power?
No.
No.
I think there's legitimate power.
Okay.
And I'm fine with that. I'm really impressed with people like Fauci and Adipur and so forth. We're, they're evidence-based. I mean, what did you call that? Justified true belief?
Yeah.
I need to explore justified true belief.
Oh, Laura and I could resource you till the end of time. So.
I'm sure, but it's more complex than just saying justified true belief. There's a whole story back there. I just stumbled on the tip of the iceberg.
Well, if I may toss in just a suggestion about that, it originates really in a dialogue of Plato called the Theaetetus, where he's struggling with defining knowledge. What does it mean to have knowledge as opposed to mere opinion or false belief? How do we know when we've got the right stuff? And they try out a number of possible definitions of what it could mean, and that's the closest they can come, but then even that definition sadly collapses at the end. But it's the closest they get, and it's interesting because there seem to be a couple elements of it, and one is to just try to enumerate the landscape of things that you need to know about, so to try to be able to understand what are all the parts and pieces that go into having a grasp of a certain subject matter. And then the other one would just be to be able to give an account of the reasons why. And so I think actually that's a very useful thing for us because it's very hard to give such an account. That's why if you've read any of Plato's dialogues, often they end in uncertainty. They end in what's called aporia, paradox. No answer is very frustrating to students. They're like, we went through this whole thing and you're not even going to tell us what? and it's like, nope, it's up to you to figure that out. That's very frustrating. So Socrates angers a lot of people by not giving answers of his own, just poking holes in their answers, which is not always a comfortable experience, right? But I think that's very important that at one point when he is about to die in the Phaedo, that's the dialogue where he's on his deathbed, right? He's giving some arguments about the existence of the soul in the afterlife. Many of us have probably struggled with these very questions, as part of your religious questioning and faith. You may ask these questions throughout your life and not necessarily have airtight arguments. They're in short supply, right? If we had an easy proof that such things were real, then we would have given it by now probably. And he knows this, so he says, here's a big risk. If you don't get those answers you want, if you don't get certainty, if you can't resolve the argument, you may become what he calls a misologist, which is like how a misanthropist is a hater of people. A misologist is a hater of the logos, a hater of reasoning, hater of arguments, right? It's like, shut up with all that nonsense. You're just talking and arguing and you never get anywhere and you never solve anything and you never get to the end of it, right? But that's what inquiry is. It's an ongoing process. You never get to the end of it. So Socrates says, whatever you do, whatever you end up believing, just don't become a hater of reason, because the problem is not with reasoning. The problem is with us. We need more information. We need more time. We're mortals who have limited time and capacity. We do the best with what we've got. if we don't get to perfect answers, perfect insight, well, that's okay, but don't give up on reasoning, right? Reasoning is the process that's helping you do the best that you can. So I don't know, I always find that very inspiring. It's like, okay, maybe I didn't figure out the answer to this one, but at least I still love reasoning, and I know that's the best way I've got going for me, right?
I'm going to use that to, oh, can I use that to transition to my question 12? Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the Phaedo sets up question 12. And, you know, Socrates is a good model for us at this point, as he often is a good model, in that, you know, the beginning of wisdom is admitting what you don't know. I always tell my philosophy students that the most important takeaway of the whole class they get on like the first day, you know, if they learn that lesson, then they're, you know, they've learned something important. But so in Phaedo, the Phaedo's his discussion of, you know, he's about to die. My last question was, so we're dealing with uncertainty, but one of the few certainties that we have in life is the fact that we are all mortal, that we're all going to die. And right now, of course, we're dealing with a great deal of death. And Socrates and other ancient philosophers taught a lot about how we should face our mortality and not fear it. So in the midst of a season of a great deal of death, what wisdom might help us in this moment?
Well, I would kind of dispute the idea that we have some kind of certainty about death. I mean, that's sort of defining the problem away. We give it a word, and yet we don't know what it is, really. I have a quote, sort of, that I hope I'm remembering correctly. And I'm wondering if I got it from, remember a book called Tuesday with Morrie? Yeah, well, I think that's where this thought came from. I may be butchering it, and I may not have the right source. But the thought was, you came into this world without any input, and you'll die without any input. So, you know, the point is to let life, let death, like the way you came into this world and the way you're going out of this world, take care of itself. You can't define death. You need to let go and let God, basically. Does anybody else remember that thought about how similar coming into this world is going out of it? Yeah.
Sounds
Okay.
very familiar.
Yeah. But I thought it was I mean, we've got this idea that we know what death is, and we don't. We have faith, we have belief, perhaps, as to what it might be and how it might happen, but we don't have certainty. We're still asking questions about it. You know, what is it like? How do we do it with dignity and grace?
Yeah, you know, Socrates says that we don't know what will happen when we die, which is why we shouldn't fear it. My students never seem all that convinced by that. They find that we don't know exactly the reason to be anxious. So,
Mm-hmm.
Daryl, Laura, anyone want to add to that? So,
I was just going to pipe in with David. This is not the source of your quote, but it reminds me of a quote from Epicurus, actually, very parallel quote from Epicurus. This is in the passage from his letter to Monetius, where he's saying that the wise man neither rejects life nor fears death. And then he goes on to say, what will happen, you know, in this context of living and dying, is neither unconditionally within our power nor unconditionally outside our power. So we won't unconditionally expect that it will occur, nor despair of it as unconditionally not going to occur. So everything is sort of subject to conditions. We won't expect anything. We won't demand anything. But we also recognize that our choices affect it. So it's not as if it's completely outside of our power. It's not as if we have no say over it. It's just that we don't expect anything unconditionally. And the whole goal here is for him to achieve a freedom of the soul from disturbance. Right? He says everything is done for the sake of being neither in pain nor in terror. And I think they feel like the worst possible things happen to us when we suffer that fear of death that can affect our choices about how we're living. I haven't really solved that myself, so I don't have any wisdom to offer on that, but I can at least give you what Epicure says, because I haven't fixed that for myself at all.
So sorry, I disappeared for a moment. I took my telephones and threw them out in the hallway. There's technology for you. My way of coping with it. Death, it occurs to me that I've had some help dealing with death. It was my daughter dying at her age 21. That was, 27 years ago. And my cancer diagnosis 5 years ago, and a really rotten, aggressive one, and then approving Audrey for hospice only a couple weeks ago. So it's I had help with it, and I think what helped was when I had long ago concluded that if God has a language, it's chaos, and which of course we mere ungodly folk can't understand by definition, and so I let it be the unknowable. Didn't fret over the unknowable part, and I also had long ago decided that if I ever had cancer, I was just going to find an oncologist that I really trusted and not Google it. I've been pretty good at that. But there's been, every 3 months, and this Monday, I shared with the church staff, Tuesday. Tuesday, I got the news, which happens about every 3 months, that my bone scans and my CT scan look this way or another way. Well, currently, they're looking perfect. And I'm feeling better than I have for years. But I haven't been fretting about death. It's just it confronts me. I can't put it off. The advantage of having cancer and knowing that your 5-year survival rate's 5%, which mine is, the advantage of knowing that is you can't put off stuff that you might have thought, well, I'm not going to die till I'm 86 anyway, and here I'm 76. I've had to deal with it. Incidentally, I don't believe my 5-year survival rate's 5% because I'm on drugs that we haven't had for 5 years. And so nobody knows what the answer is, and I'm very comfortable with that. I really feel for people who don't get comfortable with the idea of dying. I watched my father and my daughter do it, held their hand through it. If they can do it with such grace, I sure hope I can.
I had more questions, but we've gone a long time just with so I know there's always, some dialogue, but we've had a lot, in the comments, but why don't we just open it up? Anyone else who wants to ask a question or make a comment? So. Nobody else? So, well then, what do you, maybe if people are still thinking about something, I'll ask my last one then. What do you believe is really important for us to be doing as a church right now? I've asked this at the end of each of these panels, so.
Couple things that I'm just really sort of proud of that we're already doing. are reaching out to people who are isolated, because I think someone mentioned above, maybe most of us aren't dealing with urgent issues like hunger. We're not, we're safe in a shelter, we have food, we have people, but not all of us have the same access to other people right now. And that really changes the experience of being isolated. It's interestingly, a lot of people, it's so interesting to read polling on this and see that 80% of people are agreeing that this distancing is necessary and it's good, because when do we ever agree that much on anything? But people really do seem to agree on that, which inspires some confidence. But then what happens to the people who don't have anyone that they can just the human touch, it's absent for them, or they don't hear the sound of other people's voice much throughout the day? And I think that's something that we've already been working on, and it's really, really important to help with.
David, what do you think the church should be doing right now?
Well, I'm kind of new to the idea of joyful praise. And so I'm trying to figure out what it means and how to do it. And so it seems like something I would like to work on personally. And, finally, in addition, I think one of the things we can do is to share what wisdom we have. And I think there's a diversity of wisdom in this congregation. And, the more we can share it with one another, I think is a thing for us to do. And finally, I mean, you're pretty good at talking about how we need to be grateful, gratitude in general. But it bears weekly, daily, hourly reminding. And some of these things, they aren't new. They just need to have our awareness every once in a while.
To speak to one issue you brought up, one reason I'm doing these panels is one of my secondary purposes with them is to highlight the capacities internal to the congregation, to highlight the expertise, the experience, the wisdom that we do have, that we can draw on from each other. So, and I've all three of them so far, I think have demonstrated that. So, Daryl, anything you think the church should be doing?
I saw the question and thought about it, and all I could think of is more of the same. But it's quite an advantage to not be in a church or a belief system where there's answers for everything. and in fact, I think a lot of us really prefer the questions, and it's such a comfortable neighborhood to be in, because you can't, you can. I think of what's his name, Jim Fowler, and his faith stages. You can outgrow systems of belief, and we do all the time. And it's pretty hard to outgrow the one we're in, that we seem to function in. And I'm very thankful that I'm not here at 76 years of age, suddenly outgrowing my faith. This would be a bad time to do it.
Yeah, I've thought about Fowler a lot in the last couple months. A couple of did anyone have a question while that was going on they wanted to bring up? A couple of announcements before we go, more church related. Bud Cassidy had a mild stroke yesterday and is in the hospital in Bellevue. And so yesterday I communicated with both Jeremy, his son, and Sue, his sister. And Jeremy hadn't even been able to get a hold of him. And and Sue, who took him to the hospital, wasn't allowed to go in, so Bud was there by himself. And I haven't gotten an update yet today. And then my next door neighbor, Doug, who over the last year has come to church a handful of times, he has COVID-19 and is, and then yesterday, and has been sick all week, but then last night went to the emergency room and is currently in the VA. So we want to keep Doug and Bud both in our prayers. Bud is in Bellevue Hospital, so to answer that question. So thanks to David and Laura and Daryl. And then in 2 weeks, we'll have one on kind of economic and justice implications. John Els, who has done international development work. Steve Jackson, who's a public health person who's worked in HIV/AIDS pandemic for decades. And then Tracy, who works a lot on education issues and international development issues, will also be talking to us about those kind of. So we'll shift a little bit from dealing with uncertainty to now then some of the implications and ramifications of the pandemic. So, okay, well, thanks everybody. Good to see you, and I'll talk to you later.